Sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got nothing left to lose but his last breath and his loyal dog. Boone Mercer was that kind of man, worn down by life, carrying scars deeper than the ones on his face. When he bought a rotted cabin in Devil's Timber for $10, the whole town of Bitter Creek laughed at him. They said it was cursed. Men had gone missing there. Animals came out different. But Boone didn't care much about curses anymore. He rode up with his hound Redbone and figured he'd seen worse. That first night, Redbone wouldn't go inside. The dog just circled and growled, like something was breathing in there. Then Boone heard voices in the walls and footsteps on the porch. But what Redbone dug up under the floorboards changed everything. What was buried there that the town wanted to stay hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Boone Mercer wasn't always a broken man. There was a time when his shoulders carried something other than regret. A time when he'd known the weight of a good woman's hand on his arm. The sound of a child's laughter echoing through a proper home. The simple satisfaction of honest work done well. But that was 30 years gone now. Buried alongside his wife Sarah and their boy Thomas in a cemetery 3 states away. Cancer took Sarah slow. The influenza took Thomas fast. And what was left of Boone just kept on breathing. Though he couldn't rightly say why, he'd spent the better part of 3 decades drifting from one mining camp to another, one logging operation to the next, taking whatever work would have him, and moving on when the bottle got the better of his reputation. His face told the story well enough, a jagged scar running from his left temple down to his jaw, courtesy of a cave-in at the Silver Ridge Mine in 09. His hands were gnarled and calloused, marked by frostbite from a winter spent trapping in the Bitterroots when he couldn't find work anywhere else. His eyes, though, those told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who'd stopped expecting anything from life except more of the same hard road. The only constant in all those wandering years was Redbone, a blue-tick coonhound he'd found half-starved and 3-legged outside a trading post in Wyoming. Someone had caught the dog in a trap, and rather than free him proper, they just cut the leg off rough and left him to die. Boone had nursed him back, fashioned a kind of brace that helped the dog get around, and from that day forward, Redbone never left his side. The dog had more loyalty in him than most men Boone had known, and truth be told, Redbone was the only living thing Boone felt any real connection to anymore. They'd arrived in Bitter Creek on a cold October morning in 1923, riding in on the back of a freight wagon that had given them a lift from the railhead 20 miles south. The town wasn't much to speak of. Maybe 300 souls scattered among wooden storefronts that hadn't seen fresh paint in a generation. Main Street was a rutted dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The church had a steeple that leaned slightly to the east, like it was trying to get away from the saloon across the street. There was a general store, a livery, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, and a handful of other establishments that served the ranchers and trappers who worked the surrounding territory. Bitter Creek sat in a valley carved by a temperamental stream that ran strong in spring and dwindled to nothing by late summer. The valley was ringed by pine-covered hills that rose up steep on all sides. And to the north, directly north of the town proper, there was a stretch of forest so dense and dark that even from a distance it looked like a bruise on the landscape. That was Devil's Timber, and everyone in Bitter Creek knew better than to go up there after dark. Some said before dark, too, if you valued your peace of mind. Boone didn't care much about local superstitions. He'd seen real horrors in his life, the kind that didn't need ghost stories to make them frightening. He'd watched his wife waste away over 2 years, her body betraying her inch by inch until there was nothing left but pain and mercy. He'd held his boy's fevered body through a night that stretched into eternity, feeling the life drain out of him with each shallow breath. After that, what was a haunted forest to him? He'd come to Bitter Creek because he'd heard there was work at the sawmill, and because his money had run down to nothing and winter was coming on. But when he'd walked into the mill office, the foreman, a thick-necked man named Cutler with tobacco-stained teeth, had taken one look at him and shaken his head. "Too old," Cutler had said, not unkindly. "We need men who can work a full shift without their backs giving out. Try the ranches south of here. They might take you on for winter feeding." Boone had nodded and walked out, Redbone limping along beside him. He'd stood on the mill office porch for a long moment, looking out at the town, at the mountains beyond, feeling the familiar weight of failure settling over him like a heavy coat. He was 53 years old, broke, too old for hard labor and too proud to beg. The thought had crossed his mind more than once over the years that maybe it would be easier to just walk out into the wilderness and let nature take its course. But every time that darkness crept in, Redbone would nudge his hand or look up at him with those faithful brown eyes, and Boone would push the thought away. The dog deserved better than that. He'd been standing there trying to figure his next move when a voice called out from across the street. "You looking for work or just admiring the scenery?" Boone turned to see an old man sitting on a bench outside the general store, whittling a piece of pine with hands that moved with practiced ease. The man was ancient, had to be pushing 80, with a face like tanned leather and a shock of white hair that stuck out from under a battered hat. His eyes were sharp, though, and they studied Boone with an intelligence that belied his age. "Work," Boone said simply, crossing the street. "But seems like there's none to be had." The old man nodded, his knife never pausing in its work. "Cutler's particular about who he hires. Can't say I blame him. Seen too many old-timers hurt themselves trying to keep up with the young bucks." He glanced down at Redbone, who'd settled at Boone's feet. "That's a good-looking hound, even with the gimp leg." "Yours?" "He's his own," Boone said. "But he chooses to stick with me." The old man smiled at that. "Smart dog, then. Name's Ezra Holt. Been in Bitter Creek since before there was a Bitter Creek. You got a name, stranger?" "Boone Mercer." "Well, Boone Mercer, I might have something for you if you're not too particular about living arrangements." Ezra set down his whittling and fixed Boone with that sharp gaze. "There's a cabin up in Devil's Timber, maybe 3 miles north of town. Been sitting empty for near about 10 years now. Owner died without heirs, and the property reverted to the county. County's been trying to sell it for taxes owed, but nobody wants it. Got a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Boone asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The kind that keeps sensible folk away," Ezra said. "Stories about strange happenings. Men who went up there and didn't come back right. Animals acting peculiar. The usual nonsense people tell themselves when they want an excuse to be afraid of the dark." He paused, studying Boone's scarred face. "But you don't strike me as a man who scares easy." "I've seen worse than ghosts," Boone said. "I expect you have," Ezra agreed. "Point is, the county would probably let it go for next to nothing just to have someone living on the property and paying a nominal tax. Cabin's probably in rough shape by now, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. Might be enough to see you through winter if you're handy with repairs." Boone considered this. A cabin of his own, even a rough one, was more than he'd had in years. A place to weather the cold months, to rest his bones, to figure out what came next. And if it had a reputation that kept other folks away, so much the better. He was tired of people, tired of their questions and their pity and their casual cruelty. "How much?" he asked. Ezra shrugged. "County clerk's a man named Thaddeus Crane, tight with $1 but practical. Tell him I sent you. Tell him you'll take the Devil's Timber place off their hands for whatever they'll accept. My guess, $10, maybe $20 would do it." Boone had exactly $18.35 to his name. "I'll talk to him," he said. "Good," Ezra said, picking up his whittling again. "Word of advice, though. People in this town don't much care for that property. They'll think you're a fool for taking it. Don't let them rattle you. Most of what passes for truth around here is just old gossip that's been repeated so many times, folks have forgotten it started as a lie." Boone nodded his thanks and headed toward the county office, Redbone trailing behind. He found Thaddeus Crane, exactly where Ezra said he'd be, a narrow-shouldered man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, hunched over a ledger book in a cramped office that smelled of paper and dust. When Boone explained his interest in the Devil's Timber property, Crane's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "That place?" Crane said, his voice thin and reedy. "You're serious?" "I am." Crane studied him for a long moment, then pulled out a thick folder from a filing cabinet. He leafed through the papers inside, frowning. Property's been on the books for a decade. 40 acres, one structure, cabin, maybe 12 by 14 feet. Last assessment valued it at $75, but that was before it sat empty for so long. Current tax obligation is $12.50. He looked up at Boone over his spectacles. "You give me $10, I'll sign the deed over to you today. County will be glad to be rid of it." $10, Boone repeated. "That's right," Crane said. "Though I'll tell you straight, you'd be better off spending that $10 on a train ticket to anywhere else. That property's got a darkness to it. Always has." "I'll take it," Boone said, reaching for his money. Crane sighed and began preparing the paperwork. 20 minutes later, Boone walked out of the county office with a deed in his pocket and $8.35 to his name. He'd bought himself a home, or at least the rough approximation of one. The news spread through Bitter Creek faster than a summer wildfire. By the time Boone had purchased supplies at the general store, a few pounds of beans, some salt pork, coffee, matches, and a box of ammunition for the old Winchester rifle he carried, half the town seemed to know about the fool stranger who'd bought the cursed cabin. He felt their eyes on him as he walked back to where he'd left his bedroll and gear, heard their whispers and their muffled laughter. Let them laugh, he thought. He'd been laughed at before. Been pitied, been scorned, been forgotten. None of it mattered much anymore. All that mattered was getting through another winter. And now he had a place to do that. He spent the rest of that day getting directions from Ezra, who seemed genuinely pleased that someone had finally taken the property, and gathering what additional supplies he could afford. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Boone loaded everything onto his back, checked that Redbone was ready to travel, and headed north out of Bitter Creek toward Devil's Timber. The road, if you could call it that, quickly deteriorated into a rough track that wound uphill through increasingly dense forest. The pines grew thick on either side, their branches interlocking overhead to create a perpetual twilight even in late afternoon. The air grew cooler as he climbed, and quieter too. The normal sounds of the forest, birds calling, small animals rustling through the underbrush, seemed muted here, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Redbone stayed close to Boone's leg, his ears swiveling at every small sound. The dog's unease was palpable, and that concerned Boone more than any ghost story. Animals knew things that men couldn't sense. They felt currents in the air, vibrations in the earth, the presence of danger before it showed itself. If Redbone was nervous, there was probably good reason for it. After nearly 2 hours of steady climbing, the track opened into a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin that now belonged to Boone Mercer. It sat in the center of the clearing like something that had grown there rather than been built, its weathered logs the same gray-brown as the surrounding trees. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the windows was broken, patched over with what looked like an old feed sack. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Weeds and saplings had grown up around the foundation, and the whole structure had a neglected, sorrowful look to it, like an old man who'd been forgotten by his family and left to fade away alone. But it was shelter, and it was his, and that was more than Boone had expected from life in a long while. Boone stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, taking in the sight of his new home. The evening light slanted through the pines, casting long shadows that reached toward the cabin. He could see why folks in town had stories about this place. The silence was too complete, the air too still. Redbone whined low in his throat, and Boone reached down to rest a hand on the dog's head. "I know, boy," he said quietly, "but we've slept in worse places." As he approached the cabin, he noticed scratches on the doorframe that looked like claw marks, though too high up to be from any animal he knew. Carved into the door itself was a symbol he didn't recognize, a circle with lines radiating out from it, like a crude sun or star. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing a dim interior that smelled of rot and abandonment. The cabin was a single room, maybe 12 feet square. A stone fireplace stood on the far wall, a rough wooden table in the center, and a broken chair lay in one corner. He stepped inside, but Redbone remained at the threshold. The dog's ears were flat against his head, and he was growling, not aggressive but uncertain and fearful. "Come on, boy," Boone said, turning back. But Redbone wouldn't budge. He backed up, still growling, his 3 good legs planted firm. Boone had never seen the dog act this way. Redbone had faced down mountain lions without flinching, but he would not cross this threshold. Boone felt unease run down his spine. He trusted Redbone's instincts. But what choice did he have? He'd spent his last $10 on this place. "All right," he said softly. "You can sleep outside tonight." He gathered pine boughs for Redbone's bed just outside the door, then set about making the cabin habitable. He cleared debris, swept the floor, and got a fire going. Soon he had a blaze that pushed back the darkness and cold. After eating some beans and salt pork, he unrolled his blanket near the hearth. Redbone lay just outside the doorway, visible in the firelight, his eyes open and watchful. The night settled in thick around the cabin. Boone lay listening to the fire crackle, but sleep wouldn't come. The cabin felt wrong somehow, like wearing someone else's clothes. Then he heard it, a voice. Faint, muffled, like someone speaking from another room, but the cabin was only one room, and he was alone. Boone sat up, his hand moving to the rifle beside him. He held his breath, listening. There it was again. Not words he could make out, but definitely voices. Multiple speakers, having a conversation just below the threshold of understanding. Coming from the walls themselves. He stood and moved to the wall nearest the sound, pressing his ear against the rough logs. The voices were clearer here, a man and a woman, he thought, though he still couldn't make out what they were saying. They sounded agitated. Boone wasn't given to flights of fancy, and he didn't believe in haunts or spirits. But he'd heard what he'd heard. He checked the other walls methodically. The voices seemed to shift with him, always just at the edge of hearing. Outside, Redbone was on his feet, growling at the cabin itself. Old buildings made sounds, Boone told himself. Wood contracted at night. There were logical explanations. But that didn't explain why Redbone wouldn't come inside. He added more wood to the fire and settled back down. The voices had faded. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep. He must have dozed off because he woke suddenly to a new sound. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy footsteps. The deliberate tread of boots on wood. Boone grabbed his rifle and yanked the door open, stepping out into the moonlight. The porch was empty. He scanned the clearing. Nothing moved in the silver light. But the footsteps had been real. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the darkness. No answer came. Redbone stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. Not on the forest where a prowler might hide, but on the door itself. Like whatever had walked across the porch had come from inside the cabin. Boone stayed outside with Redbone for a long while, his back against a pine tree, watching the cabin. As the night wore on and nothing else happened, exhaustion won out over unease. He went back inside, barred the door, and fell into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of Sarah. She was calling to him, but he couldn't hear what she was saying. Behind her, he could see Thomas, just a glimpse of the boy's face, pale and fever-bright, and then the dream shifted, and he was digging in hard earth with his bare hands, trying to reach something buried deep, something important. He woke to grey dawn light. His hands were sore, and when he looked at them, he saw dirt caked under his nails. Fresh dirt, dark and damp. Boone stared at his hands. He hadn't been outside. He'd barred the door. But his hands were filthy, scratched and raw, as though he really had been digging. When he looked down at the floorboards, he saw fresh scratches in the wood, deep gouges that formed a rough circle about 3 feet across. Right in front of the fireplace, and Redbone, still outside, was digging furiously at the base of the cabin wall, directly below where Boone had been sleeping. The dog had excavated a hole nearly a foot deep. "Redbone!" Boone called, stepping out. "What are you doing, boy?" The dog didn't stop. He dug with singular focus, his whole body trembling. Boone knelt beside him, putting a hand on his back. Easy, boy. Redbone finally stopped, panting hard, and looked up at Boone. Then he looked back down at the hole and whined, a high, keening sound. Boone looked into the hole and saw something pale wrapped in what looked like oilcloth. Something that had been buried beneath the cabin floor, hidden away in the dark earth, not meant to be found. He reached down with shaking hands and pulled the object free. The oilcloth was old and stiff, bound with iron wire twisted in intricate patterns. The whole package was about the size of a small book, heavy and cold to the touch. He carried it back into the cabin and set it on the table. Redbone followed him inside now, the first time the dog had willingly crossed the threshold, and sat watching as Boone carefully unwrapped the wire and peeled back the oilcloth. Inside was a leather journal, its cover stamped with that same symbol from the door, the circle with radiating lines. Tucked into the journal's pages were photographs, a folded map, newspaper clippings, and a small leather pouch that rattled. Boone opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. "My name is Samuel Harding, and if you're reading this, then you've made the same mistake I did. You've bought this cabin. You've ignored the warnings. And now, like me, you need to know the truth about Devil's Timber, about what happened here in 1887. About what the people of Bitter Creek have been hiding for 36 years. About why this land was never meant to be disturbed." Boone felt his mouth go dry. He looked at Redbone, who sat perfectly still, watching him. Outside, the morning birds began to sing, a normal sound that felt jarringly out of place against the weight of what he'd just discovered. Whatever he'd bought for $10, it was far more than just a cabin in the woods. He'd bought himself a piece of someone else's nightmare. Boone sat at the table for a long time, the journal open before him, trying to decide whether to read further or leave it alone. Whatever secrets this held, they'd been deliberately buried. But he'd heard the voices. He'd felt the wrongness. If there were answers, he was going to find them. He turned the page and began to read. Samuel Harding's journal started in spring 1887. Harding had been a surveyor sent by the territorial government to map northern Montana. He'd come to Bitter Creek with 3 men, Robert Chen, a Chinese immigrant, Martin Weiss, a German geologist, and James Corrigan, a local guide. The early entries detailed their work, measurements, coordinates, observations. But by late May, the tone changed. Harding wrote about Devil's Timber. The guide, Corrigan, refused to enter it. Said his grandfather had told him it was sacred ground to the tribes. Sacred and forbidden. Harding dismissed this as superstition. He and his crew ventured into the forest anyway. That's when things went wrong. Boone read slowly as the sun climbed higher. Harding's handwriting became less neat, sometimes cramped and rushed. They'd found a clearing with stones, arranged in unnatural patterns. Symbols carved into trees, the same radiating circle on the journal's cover and the cabin's door. Evidence of old excavations, pits dug deep and filled back in. Against Corrigan's warnings, they'd begun to dig. What they found was a stone chamber, 8 feet deep, lined with fitted rocks. Inside were human bones, dozens of them, arranged in a pattern Harding couldn't decipher, and in the center was a metal box covered in those radiating symbols. They'd opened the box. Boone paused, a chill running through him. Redbone lifted his head and whined softly. Harding's journal became fragmented after that. Strange things began happening. Chen claimed something followed him. Weiss developed terrible headaches and heard voices. Corrigan disappeared one night. They found his boots and coat but never found him. Harding and the others tried to leave, but every path led them back to the clearing, to the chamber they'd opened. The forest kept them there. Then Chen died in the night, his face frozen in terror. After that, Harding and Weiss decided to undo what they'd done. They sealed the chamber, placed warnings, marked the trees, and they took the metal box out of the forest, but the box couldn't be destroyed. They tried fire, hammers, water. Nothing worked. The voices grew louder. The dreams grew worse. Finally, Weiss proposed building a cabin over one of the excavation sites and burying the box beneath it. They would bind it with iron and wrap it in oilcloth. Mark the cabin with inverted symbols as a warning. It worked, or seemed to. The voices stopped. Weiss went back east. Harding stayed on, standing guard over what they'd found and couldn't destroy. The journal ended in summer 1888. The last entry was 3 sentences. I hear them coming up from below. I should have known the cabin wouldn't hold it forever. Tell whoever finds this, don't dig. Don't ever dig. Boone closed the journal and sat back. The box, that's what had been buried beneath the cabin. The thing that had killed Harding's crew, and Redbone had dug it up. He looked around with new eyes. The scratches on the doorframe, the symbol on the door, the floorboards. It all made terrible sense. Harding had built this place as a prison, not a home. And Boone had bought it for $10 and undone everything Harding died trying to protect. He walked to where Redbone had been digging. In daylight, he could see the edge of a stone-lined chamber beneath the foundation logs, exactly like Harding had described. His dirty hands from the dream began to make sense. Whatever was buried here had been calling to him, compelling him to dig even in his sleep. He looked at the newspaper clippings tucked in the journal and spread them on the table. Survey crew disappears in Montana Territory. Lone surveyor found dead in remote cabin. Articles about people who'd tried to claim the property. A trapper in 1903 who fled and drowned himself. A prospector in 1911 found wandering, his mind gone. A family in 1914 whose youngest child disappeared, never found. The pattern was clear. This land took people, changed them, broke them, or swallowed them whole. Boone should run. Pack up, take Redbone, and get far from Devil's Timber. But where would he go? He had $8 and winter coming. He was too old to find work. This cabin, cursed or not, was his only shelter. Besides, he'd spent 30 years running from his grief, and it had gotten him nowhere. Maybe it was time to stand his ground, even if that something was beyond his understanding. He gathered the journal and clippings back into the oilcloth. Then he took the package outside and found a sturdy tree at the clearing's edge. Using his knife, he carved a notch in the bark and wedged the package inside, covering it with moss. If something happened to him, at least the next person would have a chance to find the truth. Redbone watched him work, his tail wagging now that they were outside. The morning was bright and clear. In daylight, it was hard to believe what he'd read. But Boone knew better now. He knew what lay beneath. He spent the rest of the day making repairs, fixing the window, tightening hinges, patching walls. Work had always been his refuge. He tried not to think about what would happen when night fell again, or whether he'd wake with dirty hands and fresh scratches, called by something buried deep to dig it free. That second night in the cabin was worse than the first. Much worse. Boone had prepared himself as best he could. He'd reinforced the door, built up the fire until it roared, positioned his rifle within reach. Redbone lay beside him, the dog's warmth a comfort as darkness settled over Devil's Timber, but preparation meant nothing against what came. The voices started just after sunset, louder this time, clearer. Not muffled whispers, but distinct words in a language Boone didn't recognize. They came from beneath the floor, rising up through the boards. And with them came a smell, earth and rot, and something ancient that made his stomach turn. Redbone growled, staring at the floorboards near the fireplace where the scratches had appeared before. Boone stood, rifle in hand, watching. The scratches were appearing again, slowly, deliberately, as though invisible fingers dragged across the wood. They formed the same circular pattern, deeper this time. "Stop," Boone said aloud, though his voice sounded foolish even to his own ears. The scratching continued. Then the floorboard at the center began to rise, pushed up from below by something with terrible strength. The nails groaned and squealed. Wood splintered. Boone stepped back, raising the rifle. "I said stop!" The board lifted another inch, then another, until he could see into the darkness beneath. The stone chamber Harding had written about. And in that darkness, something moved. Without thinking, Boone grabbed the board and slammed it back down, then dragged the heavy table over it, adding his own weight. The pressure from below continued for another moment, then stopped. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling fire and Redbone's growl. Boone's heart hammered. His hands shook. This was wrong, in a way that violated every natural law he understood. He stayed on the table for an hour until his legs cramped. Finally, when nothing else happened, he climbed down and checked the board. It was back in place, the nails somehow driven back into their holes. But the scratches remained and the smell lingered. Sleep was impossible. Boone sat with his back against the wall, rifle across his lap, and waited for dawn. Redbone pressed against his side. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, despite the roaring fire. Frost formed on the inside of the windows. And the voices returned, not in that strange language now, but in English. They called his name. Boone, they whispered from the walls, from beneath the floor. Boone Mercer. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but that made it worse. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw things. Zara's face, pale and wasted. Thomas burning with fever. The cemetery where he'd buried them both. And then deeper, stranger visions. The stone chamber, the bones arranged in patterns, the metal box open and empty, something crawling out. His eyes snapped open. Don't close your eyes again. The hours crept by. More than once, Boone felt the pull to sleep, but each time he jerked himself awake. He couldn't afford to sleep. Not with whatever was beneath the floor trying to claw its way up. When grey dawn light finally filtered through the frost-covered windows, the voices stopped. The cold receded. The cabin felt like just a cabin again. Boone stood on stiff legs and stepped out into the morning. The air outside was crisp and clean. Redbone bounded out after him, acting more like his normal self. Boone's whole body ached. He was exhausted, frightened, and beginning to doubt his decision to stay. One more night like that, and he wasn't sure he'd have the strength to resist whatever was calling him to dig. He needed help. He needed answers that Harding's journal hadn't provided. And the only place to get those answers was back in Bitter Creek. He left Redbone at the cabin and started the long walk down the mountain. His mind turned over everything he'd learned. The survey crew in 1887, the stone chamber and the metal box, the deaths and disappearances. But there were gaps. What had been in the box? What had the bones been meant to seal away? And why had the tribes considered this ground forbidden? The sun was well up by the time Boone reached Bitter Creek. He headed straight for Ezra Holt's place. Ezra was already there, sitting on his bench with his whittling, as though he'd been waiting. The old man looked up as Boone approached, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition or guilt? "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," Ezra said. "Figured you'd last at least a week before the place got to you." Boone stopped in front of him, too tired for politeness. "You knew," he said flatly. "You knew what was up there." Ezra was quiet for a moment, then set down his whittling. "I knew the stories, same as everyone else in this town. Stories aren't what's haunting that cabin," Boone said. "What happened up there in 1887? What did Samuel Harding and his crew dig up?" The old man's face hardened. "You found his journal." "I did. Or rather, my dog dug it up from under the cabin floor, along with something else. Something wrapped in iron and oilcloth." Boone leaned closer. "What was in that box, Ezra?" Ezra stood slowly, his joints creaking. He looked around to make sure no one was in earshot, then gestured for Boone to follow him into the general store. He locked the door behind them. In the dim interior, surrounded by barrels and canned goods, the old man finally spoke. "The tribes that lived here before us had a name for that place," Ezra said. "They called it the Breathing Ground. Said it was where the earth itself was thin, where things from below could push through if given the chance. They kept guards there for generations, making sure no one disturbed it." "The bones in the chamber," Boone said. "Those were the guards?" "Some of them, maybe. The tribes performed rituals, made sacrifices to keep whatever was down there contained. But when the settlers came, when the tribes were pushed out, those rituals stopped. And Harding's crew opened what should have stayed sealed." "What's in the box?" Boone asked again. Ezra shook his head. "I don't know. No one does. Harding never told anyone what he and Weiss found inside. But whatever it was, it changed things. And anyone who spends too long up there starts to hear the calling, starts to feel the pull to dig." "Why did you send me there?" Boone demanded. "If you knew all this, because someone had to," Ezra interrupted, his voice sharp. "The cabin can't sit empty. When there's no one living on that ground, things get worse. 2 years ago, after the last person fled, we had problems. Animals coming out of Devil's Timber acting strange. People seeing lights in the forest. We needed someone up there, someone strong enough to hold the line, and you thought a broken-down drifter was the right choice. Ezra met his gaze steadily. I thought a man who'd already lost everything might be the only one with strength enough to face what's up there. A man with nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. Boone wanted to be angry, but he was too tired. And worse, he understood the logic. The cabin needed a guardian, just as Harding had been. And Boone, with nowhere else to go, was exactly the kind of man who could take on that burden. Boone left the general store with more questions than answers, but at least now he understood his situation. He was a guardian, whether he'd chosen to be or not. The cabin needed someone to keep watch, to resist the calling from below, to prevent whatever Harding's crew had unleashed from breaking free. But Ezra had given him one more piece of information. "There's someone you should talk to," the old man had said. "Woman named Margaret Chen, lives on the east edge of town, white house with blue shutters. She's Robert Chen's granddaughter, the surveyor who died up there in 1887. Her grandmother kept some of his belongings. Margaret might know things that aren't in Harding's journal." Boone found the house easily. It was well maintained, with a tidy garden now brown and dormant. He knocked, and after a moment, a woman in her 40s opened the door. She had dark hair streaked with grey and intelligent eyes that studied him with caution. "Can I help you?" "My name's Boone Mercer. Ezra Holt sent me. I'm living up at the old cabin in Devil's Timber, and I was hoping you bought that place." Margaret's eyes widened. "Come inside, quickly." She ushered him into a modest sitting room. "My great-grandfather Robert Chen died up there," she said without preamble. "What do you know about what happened?" Boone told her about finding Harding's journal, about the voices and the scratching and the thing trying to push through the floorboards. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing troubled. When he finished, she left the room and returned with a wooden box, old and carved with intricate designs. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small leather-bound book. She handed the book to Boone. "My great-grandfather kept a diary separate from the official survey records. Most of it's in Chinese, but there are parts in English. He wrote about what they found." Boone opened it. The pages were brittle, the handwriting neat and precise. He found entries in English, brief, fragmentary, as though Chen had been too frightened to write in detail. "May 28th, 1887. Harding insists we excavate despite Corrigan's warnings. The stones suggest deliberate construction. Very old. June 3rd, 1887. We opened the chamber today. The bones inside are ancient. In the center, a box made of unknown metal. Harding wants to open it. I argued against this. Was overruled. June 5th, 1887. We should not have opened the box. What was inside, I cannot write it, but it saw us. And now it knows we are here. June 10th, 1887. Corrigan is gone. I hear voices at night. They speak in the old tongue. I understand some words. They are calling us home. June 15th, 1887. Something is following me. I see it only when I'm not looking directly. A shadow that moves against the light. We must leave this place. The final entry was dated June 18th, 1887. I will not last the night. The shadow is in the tent with me now. I can feel it watching. If anyone finds this diary, tell my family I am sorry. Tell them I should have listened to the warnings." The entry ended there, the pen trailing off. Boone looked up at Margaret. Her eyes were wet, though she held herself composed. He was only 26 years old, had a wife and baby daughter back in San Francisco. My grandmother. He never came home to them. "I'm sorry," Boone said, and meant it. Margaret wiped her eyes and reached into the box again, pulling out a folded paper. "There's something else. My grandmother drew this based on descriptions from Robert Chen's last letter home. She unfolded the paper to reveal a drawing, the symbol from the cabin door, but with additional elements. Around the radiating circle were smaller symbols, each one different, arranged in specific order. "These are sealing marks," Margaret said. According to the tribal elders my grandmother spoke with, these symbols were used by the original people to bind things that couldn't be destroyed. Each mark represents a different aspect of containment: earth, iron, water, fire, blood. Blood? Boone repeated. Margaret nodded. The final seal required sacrifice, life given willingly to keep the binding strong. That's what the bones in the chamber were, guardians who gave their lives to maintain the seal. And when Harding's crew opened the box and removed it, they broke the seal, Boone said. Yes, whatever was bound inside was released. Harding tried to contain it by building the cabin and burying the box beneath it, but he didn't understand how the symbols worked. It was temporary at best. Boone felt the weight settling over him. So the thing calling to me, it's trying to break free completely. And every night I stay there, it gets stronger. That's what my grandmother believed. She spent years researching this. She concluded that the entity feeds on the living, not their bodies, but their will, their spirit. The longer you're exposed to it, the more it drains from you, until there's nothing left. That's what happened to most who tried to live there. Boone thought about his 2 nights in the cabin. He'd felt the pull, the compulsion to dig. Each time he'd resisted, it had taken more effort. How long before he couldn't resist anymore? There has to be a way to stop it, he said. A way to seal it properly, like before. Margaret hesitated, then pulled out another paper covered in careful notes. She believed there was. The original seal required multiple elements working together. The chamber, properly constructed and consecrated. The box, placed at the exact center. The sealing marks, drawn in specific order. And the sacrifice, life given to power the binding. So I'd need to rebuild what was destroyed, Boone said. More than that. You'd need to understand the ritual, speak the words of binding, make the sacrifice. My grandmother didn't know all the details. Much of the tribal knowledge was lost. But she believed it was possible if someone had the courage and will to do it. Boone looked at the papers spread across the table. His whole life he'd been running. But here was something he could stand against. Will you help me? He asked. I don't understand these symbols or the ritual, but I'm willing to try if you'll teach me what you know. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Why not just leave? You don't owe this town anything. You could walk away right now. Because I'm tired of running, Boone said simply. I've been running for 30 years, and it hasn't brought me anything but more emptiness. Maybe this is why I came here. Maybe this is the thing I'm supposed to stand against. Margaret's expression softened. She gathered the papers and placed them back in the box. All right, I'll help you, but you need to understand what you're proposing is dangerous. The ritual requires you to confront the entity directly, and it requires sacrifice. I don't know if that means your life or something else, but it will cost you something precious. I understand, Boone said. He'd already lost everything that mattered to him. Margaret handed him the box. Take these. Study them. Learn the symbols and their meanings. I'll come up to the cabin in a few days with more supplies and whatever additional information I can gather. But Boone, don't attempt the ritual alone. Wait for me. Promise me that. I promise, he said. He left Margaret Chen's house with the wooden box under his arm and a new sense of purpose. The walk back up to Devil's Timber seemed shorter, his steps surer. Redbone greeted him enthusiastically, and together they went back into the cabin. The space felt different now. He wasn't just a victim or a guardian, he was going to be a warrior. He was going to face the thing beneath the floor and seal it away properly. He spent the rest of the day studying the contents of Margaret's box, memorizing the symbols, reading through her grandmother's notes. The ritual was complex, requiring precise timing and specific materials, and when the time came, he would need to speak the words of binding while standing directly over the chamber, facing whatever rose up to meet him. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm of preparation and resistance. During daylight hours, Boone worked methodically, following the instructions in Margaret Chen's grandmother's notes. He gathered materials from the forest, specific herbs that grew only in deep shade, stones from the creek bed worn smooth by water, pine pitch for the ritual markings. He found the herbs first, identifying them by the careful drawings. Bloodroot with its red sap, wild sage in scattered patches, and ghost flower, a pale, almost translucent bloom that grew only where something had died. Boone found these near an old elk skeleton, their delicate petals almost invisible against the forest floor. Redbone accompanied him on these trips, staying close but alert. The dog didn't range far, didn't chase squirrels. He kept Boone in sight at all times, as though standing guard. The stones were easier. 7 smooth river rocks, each the size of his palm. According to the notes, these would mark the boundaries of the ritual space, anchoring the sealing marks in place. The pine pitch required more work. He had to find trees, weeping sap, score them carefully, then heat the pitch until it reached the right consistency. It took several attempts, but by the 3rd day he had a small pot ready to use. During the day the work kept his mind occupied. But the nights were getting harder. Each evening as shadows lengthened, Boone felt the change. The temperature would drop despite the fire. The air would grow thick and heavy, and the voices would start. They were louder now, more insistent. They spoke in that strange language, but also in English, in voices he recognized. Sarah's voice calling to him. Thomas's voice asking why his papa hadn't saved him. His own father's voice telling him he'd never been worth much. Boone knew these were tricks. The thing beneath the cabin was reaching into his memories, using his deepest wounds as weapons. But knowing that didn't make it easier to bear. The scratching in the floorboards had become constant after sunset. The circular pattern was now carved so deep he could see the joists beneath. And the smell, that awful rot smell, had intensified until it permeated everything. On the 3rd night something new happened. Boone dozed off after midnight, exhausted from fighting to stay awake. He dreamed he was inside the stone chamber, digging upward toward the floor. His hands were raw and bleeding, but he couldn't stop. He woke with a gasp to find himself on his hands and knees, his fingernails torn and bloody, the floorboard pried partially up. Through the gap, he could see down into the chamber below. And in that darkness, something looked back at him. Not eyes. It didn't have eyes. But he felt its gaze, cold and hungry and patient. It knew he was weakening. Soon he would finish what he'd started, would pull up that board and reach down, and then it would have him. Boone jerked back with a cry, scrambling away. Redbone was barking frantically. With shaking hands, Boone forced the board back into place, then dragged his bedroll and the table over it. He sat there until dawn, watching the floor and praying for sunrise. When morning came, Boone examined his hands. The damage was real. His nails were torn, his fingertips scraped raw. He'd actually been digging in his sleep, trying to open the floor. The compulsion was growing stronger. Each night it took a little more of him. He was sitting at the table trying to decide what to do when he heard hoofbeats. He grabbed his rifle and went to the door. But it was Margaret, riding a sturdy mare and leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. She dismounted quickly, her expression concerned. "I came as soon as I could. I had dreams last night, bad dreams about this place. The entity is getting stronger." "It is," Boone confirmed. He held up his bloody hands. "It's taking me over, making me dig even when I'm asleep. I don't know how much longer I can hold out." Margaret's face paled, but she nodded grimly. "Then we don't have time to waste. We need to perform the ritual tonight." "Tonight?" Boone felt a spike of fear. "Are you sure?" "Look at your hands, Boone. If we wait another day, you might not be strong enough to resist when the moment comes. If it's already controlling you in your sleep, we may have already waited too long." Boone knew she was right. He could feel the thing's influence growing, like roots working through his mind. "What do we need to do?" he asked. Margaret began unloading supplies. "First, we prepare the space. The 7 stones need to be placed at specific points around the cabin. Each stone needs to be marked with a sealing symbol using the pine pitch." She handed him a paper with symbols drawn carefully. "These marks need to be drawn precisely, no mistakes. While you're doing that, I'll prepare the offerings and consecrate the space inside." "What kind of offerings?" "Tobacco, cornmeal, and the herbs you gathered. They need to be burned in a specific sequence, while speaking the words of respect to the land and the spirits that guard it. This is about restoring balance. Light against darkness, life against death, will against hunger." Margaret's hands moved efficiently. "Once the stones are marked and the offerings made, we draw the main sealing symbol on the floor, directly over the chamber. That's the most dangerous part. When we start, the entity will know what we're doing. It will try to stop us using fear, illusion, physical force, anything to prevent us from completing the seal. And the sacrifice? Boone asked quietly. Margaret met his eyes. The notes say, life given willingly to power the binding. My grandmother believed that meant someone had to choose to stay here, to live on this ground, and keep watch over the seal for the rest of their life. That's what the tribal guardians did. They lived here on the breathing ground, and they never left. Boone thought about this. A life sentence in this cabin, alone except for Redbone, and the thing sealed beneath his feet. It wasn't much different from how he'd been living for 30 years. At least here he'd have a purpose. At least here his existence would mean something. If that's what it takes, he said, then that's what I'll do. Margaret's expression softened. You're a brave man, Boone Mercer. I'm not brave, Boone said. I just don't have anywhere else to go. They worked through the afternoon. Boone placed the 7 stones, carefully drawing the sealing marks on each one. Inside the cabin, Margaret arranged the offerings and spoke the words of consecration. Smoke rose from the small fire, carrying the scent of burning sage and tobacco. As the sun began to set, they made their final preparations. Margaret drew the main sealing symbol on the floor in chalk. It was large and complex, covering most of the space in front of the fireplace. At its center was the loose floorboard. When night falls, Margaret said, we'll begin the ritual. We'll light the offerings, speak the binding words, and then you'll need to remove that floorboard and face what's beneath. The entity needs to hear the binding spoken directly, face to face. That's when it will be most dangerous. Boone looked at the symbol on the floor, at the floorboard at its center, and felt fear coil in his stomach. But he also felt determination. For 30 years, he'd been running from death, from loss, from pain. Now he was going to stand and face something that embodied all those fears. And maybe in doing so, he'd finally find a way to live with them. As the sun dipped below the western ridge and darkness claimed Devil's Timber, Margaret and Boone stood in the cabin, facing each other across the chalked symbol on the floor. The 7 stones outside had been marked and placed. The offerings had been prepared. Everything was ready. Margaret lit the tobacco first, speaking words in the old language that Boone didn't understand, but could feel the weight of. The smoke curled up toward the rafters, and the temperature in the cabin immediately dropped. The entity knew what they were doing. Stay focused, Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. No matter what you see or hear, keep speaking the binding words. Don't stop until the ritual is complete. Boone nodded, though his mouth had gone dry. He could already hear the voices starting in the walls, angrier, more desperate. Margaret lit the cornmeal next, adding it to the fire. Then the sage, the bloodroot, the ghost flower. Each offering sent up its own distinctive smoke, and with each one, the pressure in the cabin increased. It felt like being underwater. The floorboards began to shake. Not just the loose one at the center of the symbol, but all of them, rattling and groaning, as though the entire cabin were being lifted and dropped by invisible hands. Now, Margaret said, speak the words. Boone pulled out the paper where he'd written the binding phrase phonetically. His hands shook as he began to read. Taku wakan kin he oyate. The moment the words left his mouth, the loose floorboard exploded upward, slamming into the ceiling with such force that it splintered. The hole it left behind was completely dark, darker than any natural darkness should be. And from that darkness came a sound, a low, resonant hum that Boone felt in his bones. Keep going, Margaret shouted over the noise. Don't stop! Boone continued reading, stumbling over the unfamiliar words, but pushing through. With each phrase, the darkness in the hole seemed to boil and writhe, and then it began to take shape. What emerged from the hole wasn't anything Boone could have imagined. It was shadow given form, but wrong. Angles that shouldn't exist, movements that defied logic. It rose up through the opening like smoke, but denser, more solid. And as it rose, it brought with it the smell of decay and ancient earth. Boone forced himself to keep reading, even as his mind recoiled. The entity turned its attention to him, and he felt the full weight of its hatred. It had been sealed away for centuries. It had been trapped in the darkness beneath the earth, held by tribal magic and sacrifice. And Harding's crew had freed it, had given it a taste of the surface world again. For 36 years, it had been trying to break free completely. And now Boone was trying to seal it away again. The entity showed him things, visions of what would happen if he continued. He saw himself dying, his body twisted and broken. He saw Redbone torn apart. He saw Margaret burning. He saw the entity breaking free, spreading out from Devil's Timber like a plague, consuming everything, their lies. Margaret shouted, and Boone realized he'd stopped speaking. "It's trying to break your will. Keep reading!" Boone forced his eyes back to the paper, forced the words out. The entity moved closer, its form shifting. And now Boone could see faces in it, the survey crew, the people who'd tried to live here, all of them trapped, screaming silently from within the darkness. And then he saw Sarah, his wife, exactly as she'd looked the day before she died. Thin and pale, but smiling at him with love in her eyes. She reached out to him from within the entity's form. "Boone," she said in Sarah's voice, perfect and heartbreaking. "Stop this, come to me. It doesn't have to hurt anymore. We can be together again. You and me and Thomas. We can be a family again," Boone's voice caught. His eyes filled with tears. God, how he wanted that to be true. "It's not her," Margaret cried. "Boone, it's not her." "Keep reading!" But Boone couldn't look away. Sarah was crying now, reaching for him with desperate hands. "Please," she begged. "Please, Boone, I've been waiting so long. Don't leave me in the dark again. I need you." Boone's hand holding the paper dropped to his side. He took a step toward the entity, toward Sarah, toward the promise of ending 30 years of grief and loneliness. And then Redbone bit him. The dog had been outside, but somehow he'd gotten in. And now he clamped his jaws around Boone's calf, hard enough to break skin, hard enough to send a sharp spike of pain through the haze of illusion. Boone gasped and stumbled back. The pain broke the entity's hold on him, and he could suddenly see clearly again. The thing wearing Sarah's face wasn't Sarah at all. It was a mockery, a puppet made of shadow and hunger. "Thank you." "Boy!" Boone whispered to Redbone, who released his leg and stood between him and the entity. Growling, Boone raised the paper again and continued reading, his voice stronger now, more certain. The entity shrieked, an awful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and lunged toward him. Margaret stepped forward, throwing something into the fire. The flames roared up, blazing white-hot, and the entity recoiled. "Finish it!" she shouted. "Speak the final binding." Boone read the last phrases, the words that would seal the entity back into the chamber. As he spoke, the chalked symbol on the floor began to glow, not with light exactly, but with something else, some force that pushed back against the darkness. The entity fought, thrashing and writhing, trying to reach Boone, trying to silence him before he could finish. But Margaret kept feeding the fire, and Redbone stood his ground, and Boone kept speaking until the very last word left his lips. The moment he finished, the symbol flared bright, and the entity was pulled back, violently, yanked down into the hole as though by invisible chains. It screamed again, a sound of rage and defeat, and then it was gone, sucked back into the darkness beneath. The floorboard that had been blown to splinters suddenly reformed, the pieces flying back together and settling into place as though they'd never been broken. The symbol on the floor pulsed once more, then faded, leaving only faint chalk marks. The pressure in the cabin released, and Boone could breathe again. He staggered and nearly fell. Margaret caught his arm, steadying him. "You did it," she said, her voice shaking with relief. "Boone, you did it. The binding is complete." Boone looked at the floor, at where the hole had been. It was solid again, marked only by the ritual symbol. "Is it really sealed?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "The seal is restored. As long as the symbol remains intact and someone stays here to guard it, the entity can't break free again. As long as someone stays here." Boone repeated. "The sacrifice, the price of the binding." But Margaret was shaking her head, her expression troubled. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something my grandmother wrote in her notes that I didn't fully understand until now, until I saw the ritual completed." "What is it?" Margaret pulled out a folded paper from her pocket, a letter written in the same careful hand as the ritual notes. "My grandmother wrote this near the end of her life. She'd finally translated the complete version of the tribal binding ritual, and she discovered something about the sacrifice." She handed the letter to Boone. His hands were still shaking, but he opened it and began to read. The letter explained that the original guardians, the ones whose bones had been in the chamber, hadn't just lived on the breathing ground. They had been changed by it, transformed by the ritual itself. The sacrifice wasn't just giving up their freedom, it was giving up their humanity. Slowly, over years or decades, the guardians became something else. Something that could withstand the entity's influence, that could keep watch without succumbing to the calling. But that transformation came at a cost. They lost their memories, their sense of self. They became more spirit than flesh, bound to the land itself, unable to die, but unable to truly live. Boone looked up from the letter, his blood running cold. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that by completing the ritual and accepting the role of guardian, you've started the process," Margaret said, her voice heavy with guilt. "Over time, maybe years, maybe decades, you'll change. You'll forget who you were. You'll become like them, like the guardians who came before. You'll become part of the breathing ground itself." Boone stared at her, trying to process this. He'd thought he was sacrificing his freedom, his chance at a normal life. He hadn't realized he was sacrificing his very self, his identity, everything that made him Boone Mercer. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, though there was no anger in his voice, only a deep, weary sadness. "Because I didn't fully understand it myself," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "And because I was afraid that if you knew, you wouldn't complete the ritual. And then the entity would have broken free, and everything would have been lost." Boone looked at the sealed floor, at the faint chalk marks. The entity was contained. The danger was past. The town of Bitter Creek was safe, and all it had cost was one broken-down old drifter named Boone Mercer, who nobody would miss and nobody would remember. He should be angry. He should feel betrayed. But instead he felt something else, a strange sort of peace. Maybe this was what he'd been looking for all along. A way to stop being himself, to stop carrying the weight of his grief and his failures. A way to become something else, something that served a purpose. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long before I forget who I am?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know." The notes weren't clear. It could be years. It could be decades. Boone nodded slowly. He walked to the door and looked out at the clearing, at the forest beyond, at the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Redbone came and sat beside him, and Boone rested his hand on the dog's head. "Then I guess I'd better make the most of whatever time I have left," he said. Margaret stayed at the cabin for 3 days after the ritual, and in that time, Boone learned what it meant to be a guardian of the breathing ground. The changes had already begun, subtle but undeniable. He could feel the land now in ways he couldn't before, the slow pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the whisper of the wind through the pines carrying messages he almost understood. It was like gaining a new sense, one that had always been there, but that he'd been blind to until the ritual opened his eyes. Margaret taught him what she could. The seal needed to be maintained, the chalk marks refreshed monthly, the 7 stones checked and remarked if weather had worn them down, offerings made at the turning of each season. These were practical maintenance, reinforcing the binding that held the entity below. "The seal is strong now," she said on the second morning, as they walked the perimeter checking each stone. "But it will weaken over time. You need to be vigilant. If you let the maintenance lapse, if you leave the breathing ground for too long, cracks will form in the binding." "How long can I leave?" Boone asked. He was thinking of supplies, how he'd get food and ammunition if he couldn't go down to Bitter Creek. "A day, maybe 2 at most," Margaret said. "But the farther you go from the cabin, the weaker you'll feel. The transformation binds you to this place. Eventually you won't be able to leave at all." Boone absorbed this quietly. This small circle of forest, maybe a 1/4 mile in diameter, would be his entire world. "I'll bring you supplies," Margaret said. Once a month I'll make the trip up here. Food, ammunition, whatever you need. You won't starve, Boone. Why would you do that? He asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because my great-grandfather died up here. Because you're doing what should have been done 36 years ago, and you're paying a price that no one should have to pay alone. And because someone needs to remember who you were before the transformation takes that away. Boone felt something catch in his throat. He'd spent so long being alone, being forgotten, that the idea of someone choosing to remember him felt almost painful in its kindness. They worked together over those 3 days, establishing routines and protocols. Margaret showed him how to read the signs of the entity's restlessness, certain types of dreams, changes in temperature, the behavior of animals. She taught him simple versions of the binding words, and she talked to him. She asked about his life before the cabin, about Sarah and Thomas, about the years of drifting. At first, Boone was reluctant, but Margaret insisted. The transformation will take your memories eventually, she said. But the longer you hold on to them, the longer you remain yourself. Tell me your stories, Boone. Let me write them down. That way, even after you forget, there will be a record of who Boone Mercer was. So he told her. About meeting Sarah at a church social in Kansas when he was 23. About how she'd laughed at his clumsy attempts at dancing. About their wedding. About Thomas being born on a snowy February morning. About Sarah's illness, the way cancer had eaten away at her over 2 years. About Thomas surviving only 2 more years before influenza took him. And how Boone had stood at his son's grave and realized he had nothing left to live for, but also no courage to die. Margaret wrote it all down in a leather journal, her handwriting careful and clear. When Boone finished, she closed the journal and looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You've carried so much grief," she said. "Maybe the transformation will be a mercy. Maybe forgetting will finally give you peace." "Maybe," Boone said. But he wasn't sure he wanted peace if it meant forgetting Sarah's laugh or Thomas's smile. Even if those memories brought pain, they were his. They were all he had left of the people he'd lost. On the morning of the 4th day, Margaret prepared to leave. She packed her belongings and saddled her mare, while Boone and Redbone watched. "I'll be back in a month," she said, mounting up. "Sooner if you need me. If something goes wrong, if the seal starts to fail, light a fire on the eastern edge of the clearing, a big one, with green wood to make smoke. Someone in town will see it and come tell me." "I'll be all right," Boone said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to memorize his face. "You're a good man, Boone Mercer. What you're doing here, standing guard, keeping the world safe from something it doesn't even know exists, that takes real courage, or real stupidity," Boone said with a slight smile. "Maybe both," Margaret agreed. "But mostly courage." She rode down the track toward Bitter Creek, and Boone watched until she disappeared. Then he turned back to the cabin, to his new life as guardian. The next week passed quietly. Boone fell into a routine, checking the stones each morning, refreshing the offerings, maintaining the cabin, hunting small game. Redbone seemed to understand the boundaries instinctively, never ranging beyond the perimeter marked by the 7 stones. The dog would sit at the edge sometimes, looking out into the forest beyond. The nights were easier now. The voices in the walls had stopped entirely. The cabin felt like just a cabin, old and drafty, but no longer malevolent. Boone slept without nightmares for the first time since arriving, but the transformation was continuing. His sense of time was becoming fluid. Sometimes an hour would pass that felt like minutes, and other times minutes would stretch into what felt like hours. His need for food and water was diminishing. He ate still, but more from habit than hunger. And his thoughts were changing too, becoming less linear, more diffuse. Sometimes he would find himself simply existing, aware of the forest and the earth and the sealed entity below, but not thinking in the way humans thought. It frightened him at first, but as the days passed, he began to accept it. This was his path now. 2 weeks after Margaret left, Boone was checking the northern stone when he felt it, a vibration in the earth, a subtle wrongness that made his newly awakened senses flare with alarm. He knelt and placed his palm flat against the ground. A pulse from below. The entity, testing the seal. He ran back to the cabin and checked the floor. The chalk marks of the binding symbol had faded slightly. Not much, but enough. He mixed new chalk according to Margaret's instructions and carefully redrew the symbol, speaking the binding words as he worked. The vibration stopped. The seal held, but Boone understood now that this would be his life. Constant vigilance, constant maintenance, always watching for signs that the entity was stirring, always ready to reinforce the binding. 3 weeks after Margaret left, Boone woke one morning and couldn't remember Sarah's face. He tried. He closed his eyes and reached for the memory, but it was like grasping at smoke. He knew he'd had a wife named Sarah. He knew he'd loved her. But when he tried to picture her features, there was only a blur, a vague impression of brown hair and kind eyes, but nothing concrete. Panic seized him. He stumbled out of bed and grabbed the journal where Margaret had written down his stories. He flipped to the pages about Sarah and read his own words describing her. The small scar on her chin, the way she hummed when she cooked, the warmth of her hand in his. The words were there, but they felt distant, like a story about someone else's life. He tried to remember Thomas next, and found the same fog. The specifics were fading, slipping away like water through his fingers. He could remember the fact of having had a son, but not the lived experience of being a father. The transformation was accelerating. Boone sat on the cabin porch with the journal open in his lap, reading the story of his own life, trying desperately to hold on to who he'd been. Redbone came and laid his head on Boone's knee, and Boone stroked the dog's fur with shaking hands. "I'm forgetting, boy," he whispered. "I'm forgetting them." But even as he said it, he could feel something else growing in place of those lost memories. An awareness of the forest, of the cycles of growth and decay, of the deep currents of life that flowed through the earth. He could sense every tree in the clearing, could feel the small animals moving through the underbrush, could hear the voice of the wind with clarity that was almost overwhelming. He was becoming something else, something more than human but also less. A guardian, a watcher, a living seal that bound the darkness below. 4 weeks after Margaret left, as promised, she returned. She rode up the track leading her pack mule loaded with supplies, and when she saw Boone standing at the edge of the clearing, she smiled and waved, but as she drew closer, her smile faded. "Boone?" she said uncertainly. "Are you all right?" Boone looked at her, this woman whose name he knew but whose face seemed only vaguely familiar. "I'm forgetting," he said simply. "It's happening faster than we thought." Margaret dismounted quickly and came to him, taking his hands in hers. "Tell me what you remember. Tell me right now, while you still can." Boone tried. He told her about the ritual, about sealing the entity, about the past 4 weeks of maintaining the seal. But when she asked about his life before the cabin, the words wouldn't come. He knew there had been people he'd loved, losses he'd grieved, but the details were gone, dissolved into the fog of transformation. Margaret's face crumpled with grief. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault. I should have told you the truth before the ritual." "I would have done it anyway," Boone said, and realized it was true. Even knowing the full cost, he would have completed the ritual. Because the alternative, letting the entity break free, was unthinkable. "At least you remember that much," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. But even as she spoke, Boone could feel that memory beginning to fade too. Soon, he wouldn't remember the choice or the reason behind it. He would simply be what the ritual had made him, a guardian, bound to the breathing ground, keeping watch over the sealed darkness below. Margaret unloaded the supplies in silence, her movements heavy with sorrow. She looked at Boone, really looked at him, and saw what he was becoming. His eyes had changed, taking on a quality that was hard to define. Not quite human anymore, but not entirely other either. Something in between. "I'll keep coming," she said finally. "Every month I'll bring supplies. I'll read you your own stories from the journal. I'll remind you of who you were, even if you can't remember it yourself." Boone nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood why that mattered anymore. The man he'd been, Boone Mercer, husband, father, drifter, was fading away. And the guardian he was becoming didn't need stories or memories. It only needed purpose, and that purpose was clear. Keep watch, maintain the seal, prevent the darkness from breaking free. Everything else was already starting to feel like a dream. 6 months passed on the breathing ground, measured not in days, but in the turning of seasons. By the time the first snow fell in early December, Boone Mercer, the man who had bought a cursed cabin for $10, was almost entirely gone. Margaret came faithfully every month. She brought supplies that Boone no longer seemed to need. He ate less and less, showed no signs of weakness, despite what should have been inadequate. She read to him from the journal, telling him stories about his own life. Sometimes his eyes would focus on her, and she thought she saw a flicker of recognition. But mostly, he simply listened with the patient stillness of a stone. The changes were clear now. His movements had become ritualistic. He walked the perimeter with measured pace every morning, checking the 7 stones without needing to think. His speech had grown sparse. He would go days without speaking. And his eyes, once marked by grief, now held something else, a depth, an awareness of things Margaret couldn't perceive. On her December visit, Margaret noticed Redbone limping severely. The old dog moved with obvious pain, his breathing labored. She felt the lumps beneath his skin. Tumors. The dog was dying, Boone, she said. It's Redbone. He's very sick. Boone looked at her, and for a moment she saw a flash of the man he'd been. Then it was gone. I know, he said simply. I can take him to Bitter Creek. There's a veterinarian. No. Boone shook his head. He stays here. This is his home now. 3 weeks later, Margaret found Redbone's body buried at the clearing's edge, marked with a smooth river stone. Boone stood nearby, snow falling around him. I'm sorry, Margaret said. He was a good dog, Boone replied, his voice distant. Better than I deserved. After that, the transformation accelerated. Without Redbone to anchor him to his humanity, Boone became more guardian than man. He stopped sleeping in the cabin, remaining outside regardless of weather. He stopped eating entirely. By March, he barely spoke at all. In April, Margaret arrived to find the clearing empty. No smoke from the cabin. No sign of Boone at any stone. Then she saw him. He stood at the exact center of the clearing, perfectly still. His eyes were closed, and he was covered in morning dew, as though he'd been standing there all night. Boone? Margaret called cautiously. His eyes opened. They had changed. No longer brown, but something that reflected light strangely like deep water. The seal is failing, he said, his voice carrying an odd resonance. The entity is growing stronger. Margaret felt her blood run cold. What? How? The binding was meant to be sustained by multiple guardians, but I am only one, and the entity has had 36 years to study the seal, to probe for weaknesses. It has found them. What do we do? Margaret asked. Boone was silent for a long moment. There is a way, but it requires going back to the beginning, to the source. The stone chamber, Margaret said. Where Harding's crew first opened the box. Boone nodded. The original seal was placed there in the deep earth. If I can reach it, if I can speak the binding words directly to the source, I can reinforce what the ritual began. But it means going down into the darkness. It means confronting the entity in its own domain. Margaret shook her head. No, that's too dangerous. I'm already close to it, Boone interrupted. I feel it constantly pressing against the seal. Every day it grows stronger, and every day I grow weaker in my humanity and stronger in my purpose. Soon I won't be able to resist going down there. Better to go now while I still have some choice. Boone, listen to me, Margaret Chen. You have been kind to me. You have remembered me when I could no longer remember myself. For that I am grateful. He paused, and for just a moment she saw Boone Mercer looking out at her. But this is my purpose now. And I need you to trust that I know what must be done. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. When? Tonight, Boone said. When the moon rises. The entity is strongest in darkness, but so am I now. I'm part of the breathing ground. What can I do? Stay here, Boone said. At the cabin. If the seal holds, if I succeed, the forest will tell you. The birds will return to singing. But if I fail, take the journal and leave Devil's Timber. Warn the people in Bitter Creek. Tell them to evacuate. I won't leave you, Margaret said. You will, Boone replied, iron in his voice now. Because if I fail, There will be nothing left of me to save. And someone needs to survive to tell what happened here. Margaret saw the finality in his expression. This was decided. She spent the rest of the day helping Boone prepare. He gathered the ritual materials, herbs, stones, a knife made of cold iron. He spoke the binding words over and over. And as the sun began to set, painting the clearing in shades of orange and red, he stood before the cabin door and looked at Margaret one final time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Then he opened the door and went inside. Margaret watched as Boone knelt at the center of the floor, over the binding symbol. The moon had risen, full and bright, casting silver light through the windows. In that light, Boone looked almost translucent, more spirit than flesh. He placed his hands flat on the floorboards and spoke words in the old language. The wood beneath his palms began to glow. Then with steady pressure, Boone pushed down, and the floorboard gave way, not breaking but opening, like a door waiting to be unlocked. Darkness welled up from the opening. Not simple darkness, but something deeper, more absolute. The kind of darkness that existed before light was ever conceived. And with it came cold, the cold of deep earth. Boone looked back at Margaret one last time. His eyes reflected the moonlight with an otherworldly gleam. "Remember," he said. Then he lowered himself into the opening and disappeared into the darkness below. Margaret stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she'd made a promise. She would wait. She moved to the edge and looked down. The darkness was so complete she couldn't see anything. "Boone?" she called, but her voice seemed to be swallowed. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time felt strange. Margaret kept her vigil, listening for any sound from below. Then the cabin began to shake. It started as a tremor, but quickly grew into violent shaking that rattled the windows and sent dust raining from the rafters. Margaret grabbed the table to steady herself. The opening in the floor pulsed with darkness, expanding and contracting like something breathing. From deep below came a sound, the same resonant hum she'd heard during the ritual, but louder now. The entity knew Boone was there. It knew what he was trying to do, and it was fighting back. The temperature plummeted. Margaret's breath came out in white vapor. Frost spread across the windows, and the darkness was trying to push up out of the opening. Margaret grabbed the pouch of salt and began pouring it in a circle around the opening, speaking words of protection. The salt sizzled when it touched the darkness, creating a barrier that held it back, barely. A scream echoed up from below. Boone's voice twisted with pain. Margaret's heart clenched, but she forced herself to maintain the salt circle. The shaking intensified. Cracks appeared in the walls. One window shattered. The binding symbol beneath the opening began to glow brighter. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The shaking ceased. The hum cut off. The darkness retreated. The cabin fell utterly silent. Margaret held her breath. "Boone?" She called down, no answer. "Boone!" She called again, louder, her voice breaking. Still nothing. Margaret made a decision. She had to go down. She had to see for herself. She grabbed a lantern, lit it with shaking hands, and lowered herself into the opening. The descent was disorienting. Just a rough tunnel that seemed to shift around her. The walls were cold stone, slick with moisture. The air was thick, tasting of copper and rot. She climbed down for what felt like an eternity. Finally, her feet touched solid ground. She was in the stone chamber from Harding's journal. The walls were lined with fitted rocks, the floor marked with ancient symbols. In the center, kneeling on the ground, was Boone. He was alive, but changed. His body seemed less solid, becoming transparent. The symbols around him glowed with intense light, and his hands were pressed against a metal box, the box that Harding's crew had opened 36 years ago. "Boone," Margaret whispered. Approaching carefully, his head turned toward her slowly. His face was serene, peaceful. "I did it," he said, his voice echoing. "The seal is restored. The binding is complete. The entity is contained. Truly contained. Then come back up," Margaret said, reaching for him. "You've done what you needed to do." But Boone shook his head. "I can't. The seal requires a guardian. Not above, but here, down in the deep earth, standing between the entity and the surface world." This is where I need to be." "No," Margaret said, tears streaming. "You can't stay down here. You can't." "I'm not Boone anymore," he said gently. "Not really. That man died the moment he completed the ritual. What I am now, this is my purpose, and I'm at peace with it. But you'll be alone," Margaret protested. "Forever, I won't be alone," Boone said, and he smiled, a real smile. "The breathing ground is here with me. The spirits of the guardians who came before. And somewhere, in whatever part of me still remembers being human, I carry the memory of love, of Sarah and Thomas, of Redbone, of your kindness." "That's enough!" The light from the symbols was growing brighter, and Boone's form was becoming more translucent. Margaret realized he was merging with the seal itself. "Go now," Boone said, his voice already distant. "Go back to the surface. Live your life. And sometimes, when you're up in Devil's Timber, know that I'm here. Know that I'm keeping watch. I'll remember you," Margaret said through her tears. "I promise I'll remember. I'll tell your story." Boone's smile widened. "You tell them I was a man who found his purpose. That's enough." And then he was gone. Not dead, not destroyed, but transformed completely. His physical form dissolved into light that spread across the symbols on the chamber floor, reinforcing them, strengthening them. The metal box sealed itself with a sound like a lock clicking shut. The entity was sealed. The binding was complete. And Boone Mercer, guardian of the breathing ground, had become eternal. Margaret climbed back up to the surface, her legs shaking, her heart heavy with grief and wonder. When she emerged from the opening in the cabin floor, she found that it had sealed itself behind her. The floorboard was whole again, the binding symbol still visible but fainter now, settled into the wood like an old scar. There was no way back down to the chamber, no way to reach Boone, even if she wanted to. She stood in the cabin for a long moment, feeling the change in the air. The oppressive weight that had always hung over this place was gone. The rot smell had vanished. The cold that seeped through the walls even in summer had lifted. The cabin felt like just a cabin now, old, weathered, but no longer haunted by anything more than memories. Margaret stepped outside into the clearing as dawn began to break over the eastern ridge. The forest was waking up around her in ways she'd never heard before. Birds were singing, not just one or two, but dozens of them, their songs filling the air with life. A red squirrel chattered from a nearby pine, and in the distance she heard the bugling call of an elk. The breathing ground was breathing freely again, no longer choked by the entity's presence. The seal was complete. Boone had succeeded. Margaret walked to each of the 7 stones, checking them one final time. The symbols carved into them glowed faintly in the dawn light, but it was a gentle glow now, peaceful rather than urgent. The boundary they marked was no longer a prison, but a memorial. A reminder of what had been sacrificed here and what had been saved. She found Redbone's grave and knelt beside it, placing her hand on the smooth river stone that marked the spot. "He did it, boy," she whispered. "Your friend did it. He saved us all." Before leaving Devil's Timber, Margaret went back into the cabin one last time. She gathered the journal where she'd written Boone's stories, carefully wrapped it in oilcloth, and placed it in her pack. She would take it back to Bitter Creek. She would preserve it. And someday, when the right time came, she would share Boone Mercer's story with the world. She also left something behind. On the table in the center of the cabin, she placed a photograph, one of the few possessions she'd brought from her own family's collection. It showed her great-grandfather Robert Chen, young and smiling, standing with the survey crew before they'd ventured into Devil's Timber. Beside him in the photo were Martin Weiss and James Corrigan and Samuel Harding, all of them looking so alive, so full of hope and ambition. They hadn't known what they would unleash. They hadn't understood the forces they were tampering with. But in the end, their mistake had brought Boone Mercer to this place, and Boone had finished what they'd started. He'd sealed away the darkness and given his very existence to keep the world safe. Margaret rode down the mountain as the sun climbed higher, painting the forest in shades of gold and green. The track that had always seemed so dark and foreboding now looked like any other mountain trail. When she reached Bitter Creek, people stopped to stare at her. surprised to see her returning from Devil's Timber alive and unharmed. Ezra Holt was sitting on his bench outside the general store, whittling as always. He looked up as Margaret dismounted, and something in his eyes told her he already knew. "The seal holds," he asked quietly. "The seal holds," Margaret confirmed. "Boone Mercer saw to that?" "He became the Guardian. The true Guardian, down in the deep earth where the entity can never reach him." Ezra nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Then the debt is paid. The old wrong is made right, and Bitter Creek can rest easy, knowing that man gave everything to protect us." "Will you tell people?" Margaret asked. "Will you tell them what Boone did?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, his knife moving steadily across the wood in his hands. "I'll tell them what they need to know. That the cursed cabin isn't cursed anymore. That Devil's Timber is safe. That a brave man made a great sacrifice." He paused. "But the details, the entity, the ritual, all of that, I think that's a story for you to tell when the time is right. You knew him. You were there. You're the one who should preserve his memory." Margaret nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I will, I promise." She kept that promise. For the rest of her life, Margaret Chen made the journey up to Devil's Timber once a month, just as she'd done when Boone was still partly human. She maintained the cabin, kept the clearing clean, tended to Redbone's grave. And she felt Boone's presence there, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as something deeper, a peace that permeated the forest, a watchful awareness that kept the darkness at bay. Years passed. Margaret grew older, her hair turning white, her steps becoming slower. But still, she made the journey because she'd promised to remember. And Margaret Chen always kept her promises. One spring morning, when she was well into her 70s, Margaret made her final trip to Devil's Timber. She knew it would be her last. Her heart was failing, her body worn out by decades of hard living and faithful service. She sat on the cabin porch in the warm sunshine, the journal open in her lap, and read Boone's stories aloud one more time. She told the story of a man who'd lost everything and spent 30 years running from his grief. A man who'd bought a cursed cabin for $10 because he had nothing left to lose. A man who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest courage comes from standing your ground, even when, especially when, the cost is everything you are. When she finished reading, Margaret closed the journal and looked out at the clearing. The 7 stones stood in their places, weathered by time, but still marked with their protective symbols. Birds sang in the trees. The creek bubbled in the distance. And somewhere below, deep in the earth, Boone Mercer kept his eternal watch. "Thank you," Margaret said softly to the forest, to the breathing ground, to the guardian who would never leave his post. "Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for letting me be part of your story." A breeze moved through the pines, gentle and warm, carrying with it something that felt almost like an answer, almost like a friend saying goodbye. Margaret Chen died peacefully that afternoon, sitting on the porch of the cabin in Devil's Timber, the journal clutched to her chest. They found her 3 days later when she didn't return to town, and they buried her in the Bitter Creek Cemetery with full honors. But before they laid her to rest, they found a note she'd left, along with instructions. The journal with Boone's stories was to be donated to the County Historical Society, to be preserved and shared, so that future generations would know about the man who'd saved them from a darkness they never knew threatened them. The cabin in Devil's Timber still stands today. No one lives there. The property has been designated as protected land, a historical site maintained by the county. Hikers sometimes venture up the old track to see the place, drawn by the story of Boone Mercer, the mountain man who bought a cursed cabin and became a legend. They find a peaceful clearing, a weathered cabin, 7 stones marked with strange symbols. They find a grave marker for a 3-legged dog named Redbone. And if they're quiet, if they listen carefully to the wind moving through the pines, some say they can feel it, a presence watchful and eternal, standing guard over the breathing ground. The entity sealed beneath the earth will never break free. Not as long as Boone Mercer keeps his vigil, not as long as the binding holds, Not as long as love and sacrifice and stubborn courage continue to mean something in this world and in the deep earth. In the chamber lined with ancient stones and marked with symbols of power, a light continues to glow. It pulses with the rhythm of the forest above, with the turning of seasons and the passage of years. It's neither alive nor dead, neither human nor spirit, but something in between. Something eternal. It is a guardian, a watcher, a man who found his purpose and gave everything to fulfill it. It is Boone Mercer, and he is finally at peace.